been refining the system for decades, but what if it's time to redesign it? Not from scratch, but from what we know works. You're listening to Education by Design. I'm your host, Phil Evans. Welcome back to the 10th episode and part 2 of Challenge-Based Learning, where we explore how communities and organisations can co-create the future of high-stakes learning. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by Jenny Gillett, an architect behind the IB's groundbreaking systems transformation pilot. For well over 2 years, Jenny has partnered with the United World College communities from Atlantic College in Wales to Vancouver in Canada. The United World Colleges movement began in 1962 when German educator Kurt Hahn opened Atlantic College in South Wales. Hahn didn't just set out merely to prepare students for university. He believed schools should be a force to unite people, nations and cultures for peace and sustainable futures by helping young people to develop resilience through real-world challenges. He famously argued that embracing both successes and failures through experiential learning builds the character and agency tomorrow's leaders need. Today, Jenny Gillett's systems transformation pilot carries forward that legacy, weaving systems thinking and challenge-based assessments into deeply collaborative learning experiences. To start with, I think it's important to understand why this is so different from a traditional educational model.
I think what's really interesting about the systems transformation pilot is it's transdisciplinary and it's assessed through more sort of authentic assessment tasks that are non-exam based. And transdisciplinary and non-exam based are two quite radical things for the IB diploma in a kind of high stakes assessment. We have little bits of those things. So we have transdisciplinarity in our theory of knowledge course, or we have, for example, art subjects that are non-exam based. But I think challenging two of those pretty fundamental tenets of our usual diploma, disciplinarity and exam-based assessment, is super exciting to be able to put forward a course that really asks questions about both of those things.
So what is it that students are actually going to be learning about?
So the systems transformation pilot, the reason it's called systems transformation is because it's half about kind of systems thinking and design thinking skills. So it's very much about the mindset and the skills of systems thinking. But the reason it's systems transformation rather than systems thinking is that we really wanted that focus on kind of that action orientation and that experiential element to the course. So it's not just about sort of passively understanding systems and mapping systems. It's really about how do you actually bring about change? How do you identify leverage points that are opportunities to bring about change in a system? So that's the sort of starting point for that course.
And it sounds like it's almost impossible to assess in that regard because this sounds very big. So what does the assessment actually look like?
Yeah, so this experience obviously is meant to be the last 2 years of school. It's meant to be the culmination of their kind of high school experience. But it's really meant to have this practical hands-on focus, this kind of getting out into the world, engaging with the community, not just kind of sitting in a classroom studying about it from a book, but actually being exposed to the real world. And so because that's the focus of the course, we really wanted the assessment to really reflect that kind of teaching and learning. We didn't want this kind of more radical pedagogy and then to have a more traditional assessment. We wanted the two to really feed into each other and to have a kind of positive relationship and a positive backwash between the curriculum and the assessment. So we figured, the course is meant to be about complex systemic issues to do with kind of sustainability and social issues. So they're these complex things that don't fit into neat little boxes. And we really wanted an assessment that reflected that kind of that thinking and grappling and exploring a bit more rather than just giving the answer.
That's super refreshing. Jenny, before you tell us what the assessment's all about, how do you decide what systems transformation topics the students are going to explore?
So we've actually, because this is such a complicated project, we're starting with 4 pilot schools, and each of the 4 schools is doing something slightly different with their curriculum models. So
Cool.
they've all got pretty similar aims. They're all around systems transformation,
Hmm.
but then the schools have been given the flexibility to put a particular emphasis on a particular area or to structure it in a particular way.
Right.
So the first pilot school in the UK, they are really focusing on what they call these impact areas, these systems. So food, migration, biodiversity, and energy. So you're looking at the food system as an example of a system. Our second pilot school in Singapore, their project lenses are around intercultural understanding, sustainability, and peace. So slightly different lenses, but actually getting at a lot of the same underlying kind of issues and the same competencies that they want the students to kind of express, but just coming at it from slightly different angles, organizing it in slightly different ways. And that's part of what we want to learn from the pilot is there a more effective way to structure this? How do students find it accessible? How do teachers find it accessible to teach? So all of the curriculum is looking slightly different, but with these same sort of foundational tenets across all 4 schools. But as I say, because we had that kind of a curriculum, you need to have a different, interesting assessment. You can't have the same kind of assessment that we have in some of our other subjects. So we decided to design 4 assessment tasks. 2 project-based tasks, 1 case study-based task, and 1 competence portfolio-based task. So they do these 4 assessments. For the first pilot school, they're doing 1 individual project, 1 collaborative project, 1 case study, which is an unseen, day-long, bit like a kind of hackathon or a kind of design sprint format where they look at an unseen case study. And then throughout the course, they keep a competencies portfolio and they curate a small section of that portfolio to submit for assessment at the end of the course.
Wow. So students really have a great sense of agency about how they're being assessed.
Yeah, and hopefully there is that agency. And the case study day is a really interesting example, I think. So we really wanted to design something that had the look and feel much more like their teaching and learning activities that they do in their regular classrooms and less like a kind of exam hall. So the other 3 tasks that are all project and portfolio based are very open-ended and can take a really long period of time. And for some students, that can actually be quite stressful. If you think about things like workload, you can have really conscientious students who will spend a lot of time on open-ended tasks. So we wanted to make one of the tasks more sort of contained and controlled. So we decided on this sort of 1-day assessment experience, we've called it. So it's not an exam, it's kind of an assessment day. But the idea is that they work collaboratively in the morning, unpacking this unseen case study, doing exercises like stakeholder mapping. So it's quite a kind of structured, scaffolded morning of collaborative activities. And then in the afternoon, they work individually. But what's really nice about it, as I say, is it has that look and feel. It feels much more like a classroom. And that was really intentional in the design of it. We wanted to give that time for them to explore and discuss.
I mean, that must give students who experience test anxiety such a greater range of ways to demonstrate what they understand and what they can do.
Absolutely. And also we wanted to just give them an opportunity to show what they can do in different kind of formats. So the morning is collaborative activities that are quite structured. The afternoon is individual. But also the 3 artifacts that they submit for assessment. 1 is a visual, it's a stakeholder map. 1 is an oral presentation as a group. They summarize their insights from the morning as a group. And then the last piece is a written individual piece. So it's got the visual, the oral and the written components to the day. So hopefully all students find something. It's not all in one format. You've got that diversity of modalities and that diversity of formats that hopefully just help it appeal to a range of students.
So one, aspect of this collaborative innovation is that you're really thinking and grappling with the type of curriculum and the type of content and the type of context for learning. But on the other end, you're grappling with team theory and group theory and how do we meaningfully and authentically assess students in a collaborative setting?
Yeah, I mean, collaborative assessment is a notoriously kind of thorny issue. If you look in the assessment literature, or anyone who's just managed group work in schools. I'm sure every teacher who's tried to deliver group work will tell you it can be a source of contention and fallouts between students, and it's got a lot of challenges. But it's also, if we talk about authenticity and we talk about preparing students for the world that they're going to live in, this kind of collaborative activities are the things that we do, all of us, all the time. And particularly with systems, systems work, there's a phrase, systems work is together work. You don't transform a system on your own. By definition, you've got to do relationship building. You've got to collaborate. Felt like it wasn't just making something collaborative to be trendy or for the sake of it. It's because it feels like it's really deep rooted and authentic to the discipline. But obviously the logistics of it and the kind of even the philosophical sort of rationale for it is quite challenging, because for example, if you've got students working in groups, you have a key question of whether you're going to award group marks for the performance of the group as a whole, or whether you're going to try to reward individual performance within the group and give individual marks. Most people argue that the true collaboration, then you'll get a group mark. But then the problem for that is, what do you do if one student isn't pulling their weight? What do you do if one student's off ill for that period of time, or 2/3 of it, and is there for a third of it?
And then you've got the reality of group dynamics too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for example, you could have the IB saying, these are the randomly assigned groups. You could have teachers assigning groups so that they can avoid particular conflicts between personalities in the class. You can do kind of purposely mixed ability groups. There's all sorts of different options, and each of those has pros and cons. So if I put my kind of assessment hat on, I have to think about things like, if I put students in mixed ability groups and all of the groups are mixed ability groups, does that squash all of my marks to the middle and make setting grade boundaries really difficult, for example, and you don't get a full spread of marks? What we're doing across the 4 pilot schools is experimenting with a few different types of collaborative assessment. So in this first cohort, we have a kind of co-authored section of a report with a group mark. So that's at sort of one end of the spectrum, is it's a completely co-authored product with a completely joint group mark. For some others, we have pieces where, for example, in the oral presentation in the case study, each student is required to talk for 2 minutes about one stakeholder. They're allowed to prepare it together, but each student has to take on the accountability and responsibility of representing one stakeholder in the presentation. And then in some of the other components, we're exploring things like peer feedback. We're exploring things that get at some of the skills without being a collaborative task. So, for example, a pitch to a panel. So you pitch your project idea to a panel that consists of a teacher, a peer student, and an expert from the community. And then you have to write a piece about how you've engaged with their feedback, how you've incorporated or rejected their feedback. So you're getting at some of those same skills around listening, engaging with feedback, interacting with people, but it's not a collaborative task. So across the pilot, we're trying out some different formats. But yeah, quite exciting really, to help the IB think through this wider issue of our stance on collaborative assessment.
I just can't stop thinking about how important the relational aspect of this is. Like, you're teaching students how to collaborate in contexts that may not be comfortable to them. This is a real world skill, that sometimes the work has to be done, and we might not always know how to approach different, colleagues in our work. But the trick is to actually try, and to do that through relationship building.
I think it was really interesting. So I did some video interviews with some students at the end of the first cohort. They were just coming to the end of their time. It was their last week of school, and I did some interviews with them last month. And a lot of them actually pulled out the collaborative element as their sort of highlight from the course. But I think what was really clear from the student feedback was, you can't do that kind of collaborative assessment in a more traditional course and without the groundwork that's put in over the 2 years in the class and the kind of cohort building and skills that are developed. I think if you tried to do that kind of assessment when it hadn't been, the kind of groundwork hadn't been laid throughout the first year, I don't think it would have gone as well as it did. So I think that was a really interesting learning for me, and the feedback from the students was they all talked a lot about the intentionality and the deliberateness with which the teachers had really tried to build those relationships. The fact that they'd been often working in small groups on multiple small projects, but constantly changing the group. So there were 24 students in that first class, and they were all working with each other in different sort of varieties of groups. So across that first year, they sort of all worked with each other, and they got really used to all sort of, who they were going to work with. And it wasn't, usually you had your group and that was it. And then suddenly it would have been difficult to work with someone else. They were all very used to kind of interacting. And I think, for me, I thought that was a really interesting point about that cohort building and that kind of relationship between the students that sometimes can get a little bit overlooked. But I think even, for example, in the way they ended the course, normally, you end the course with getting ready for an exam, and then you might not see the students again. But because it didn't have that as an end to the course, the teachers were really deliberate about how they really ended that course, and kind of had a sort of sense-making piece at the end, and thinking about how you want to go on and be a kind of change maker in the world beyond school. And it built in the time for that right at the end, in those last few weeks of the course, that perhaps you wouldn't do in a course that ended with an exam, because you'd be in sort of intensive revision kind of mode, getting ready for the exam. And it was just a very different kind of headspace for the students and the teachers to be in. But I thought that was super interesting for me, the fact that, as I say, the things like that weren't necessarily as intentional or on my mind when we were designing the pilot have come out as just being really important, and really important foundations for the other more pieces of work that were more obvious were going to be different to a normal course.
Perhaps this would be a good time for us to listen to what some of the students said after they came out of that full day assessment day that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, I'm very happy to share this feedback from these two students. So these two students had just completed the case study assessment day. And one of the teachers at the school recorded them reflecting on their day and reflecting on their experience. So I'm very happy to share that, to give a sense, I think, of the enthusiasm for this pilot, and also how it reflects some of the things that we think are really important, that ability to think critically and to apply those skills to something unfamiliar, and to really kind of grapple and think through and explore a complicated issue in an assessment environment.
Let's take a listen.
Hey, Jenny, I've just asked two students who did the assessment on Tuesday to tell you what they think of it.
Hello, Jenny.
Introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Ray.
And I'm Elsa.
And we're both from the grade 11 Systems Transformation class.
Yeah.
And we just had a exhausting Tuesday.
But we really loved it.
Yes.
It was so different to anything we've ever done in an exam setting. And I mean, although it was very exhausting, it was also, like Ray put it, exhilarating.
Exactly.
Cool. We're a part of this new beginning and journey for education.
And in comparison to other exams, it felt less like I had to take all the knowledge I already know and put it on a paper. It felt more like an actual test of my ability to critically think and figure stuff out in a very short period of time.
Yeah.
Because we were kind of confronted with this thing that we've never seen in our lives. And then suddenly, how do I approach this? And I found myself actually pulling skills from other subjects, like philosophy, like critical analysis I learned in philosophy, like techniques I learned in philosophy, and just throwing that out. And it was something, the skills from that can be very widely applied. And it's more of a really true test of not really academic pressure, but real life pressure that you'll feel when you're on a deadline and you're in a room with other people and you have to work things out fast.
I think the other thing is it's a bit of a hybrid of how do you collaborate with others and how do you understand group dynamics and take advantage of them so that you can all thrive, but then also looking at what can you do independently in this kind of situation. And so to have that opportunity, I found it really incredible that other people will be able to experience that at one point.
I mean, that says it all, doesn't it? Just how powerful this educational experience is, that students value the assessment experience just as much as they did in the classroom. It also reminds me of another testimony that one of the students said in a video that folks can watch in the show notes. He was just saying how we just don't get exposure to the complexity of these big systems problems until well and truly after we've finished our education, and we're now sort of it's years later and we're finally getting ourselves ourselves into industry and we're having to approach the actual problem in real time. And that's the difference. You're giving high school students the experience to be able to approach these complex problems and to understand and to even find an interest and maybe an area where they could make a contribution really, really early on.
But I just want to pick up on something you said there that I think is really important, which is that balance in this course that we're trying to get between really kind of that sense of agency and that sense of urgency, but then also that kind of intellectual humility and that awareness of the kind of complexity. Because I think that's the balance with a course like this. It's like you really want to have students feeling inspired that they can make change, but you also don't want them kind of, running blindly off and starting projects without an understanding of the potential impact on the communities that they're working with, or, you have to just be really careful there. So, for example, with the first group, their projects, they were allowed to do near school, or in the school, but they were also allowed to do them in any context of their choice. But it had to be a context that they had a meaningful existing relationship with. It had to be a context that they had like a kind of genuine relationship of an accountability with. So it wasn't just like, I'm going to pick a random country and go and do this project, that sort of volunteerism type approach at all. And I think it's been really important to us all the way through this pilot work, really. It's trying to expose students to the idea that things are more complicated than they might seem. There's people's different perspectives, and even within particular groups, you can't sort of assume that a group will have a single perspective, but yet at the same time, not to overwhelm them with that difficulty and kind of paralyze them with that complexity and difficulty, but say, actually, you can still act and you can still do things, but you just need to have that awareness and that open-mindedness and that humility to realize that you're not necessarily going to solve something. You might help something, or you might help with a part of it, but not another part of it. But I think I asked the students that question. I asked them, has the course been sort of depressing and all about kind of all the problems in the world, or has it been sort of inspiring? And every single one of them that I spoke to said, no, it's been super inspiring to feel like you can make a difference, and even that small things can make a difference. This sense of kind of empowerment and this sense that even doing a small thing can in the end have a really big difference.
I just think it's amazing how students are making the connections between what they're learning in their regular coursework and what they're doing in the systems transformation, transdisciplinary assessment. You really have proven that it's possible to give students the kind of learning experience that really connects things together. And that is revolutionary in a world where everything is so content-centered and so disciplinary. Many of the, advanced coursework programs around the world aren't really programs. In fact, they're just individual discrete courses that don't have a connection. Even if students take multiple courses within that same, paradigm, they're not really designed to make connections. And for me, this is what education by design is all about. It's actually the intentionality. We should be looking for systems that help students to make connections, because that is how we solve problems, by understanding how things are related.
Yeah, I think for me, what really impressed me about that video was not just the enthusiasm and the fact that it's kind of novelty, it's a bit different to what they do before, but the students were really so aware and so kind of clear on what they enjoyed about this assessment, and the fact that they were able to take things from other subjects and apply them, the fact that they could draw on these things rather than just kind of having to kind of dump everything that was in their brains onto a piece of paper, that they really genuinely felt like they were being asked to think, or the fact that they appreciated the fact that there was the collaborative and the individual parts to the day. And what was really lovely, having obviously worked on the design of that task, is to see the things that you hope for and the things that you try to build into a design actually coming through into practice, and the students picking up on them. And the other thing that didn't really come through on the video, but I thought was a really interesting piece of feedback, was we deliberately designed that task to be completed in the first year of the 2 years of their programme. The idea is that it will scaffold them towards then designing their own projects. So the idea is that they've kind of applied this thinking to a case study and looked at an intervention that someone else has tried to do in a system and evaluated it. But then the next step is before they go off and do their own projects. And that links to that point about that kind of intellectual humility of understanding what someone else has tried to do and what barriers they encountered and what the strengths and weaknesses of that approach were before they go off and start doing their own project. And then the other reason we put it in year one of the programme was really to try to address the kind of issues of well-being and workload, to try and spread out the workload a little bit. So for those two students, what's really nice is by Easter of year one, they've wrapped up a piece of their work that's worth 15% of their overall grades, just for, spreading out that workload rather than sort of everything coming at the end of the 2 years, to have that piece out of the way 6 months into the programme.
You know, it's just so interesting that we're talking about assessment for learning, and so many education programs or systems, curriculums say that, you know, it's assessment for learning, but everything's sort of at the end of the course. But, you know, we're talking about students that are applying their learning and what they've gained from their assessment to their future learning, and, you know, that kind of spiraling on and that building of, you know, it's lifelong learning in action. And I think that's just so important, that intellectual humility to kind of say, I'm still learning, I'm still grappling, especially in a world that's just so paralyzed. I mean, this just gives me hope that, you know, that there's an education model, even if it can't be replicated in lots of different spaces, that it gives us sort of something to show that education and schooling could be different.
Absolutely. And I think this pilot's, you know, very ambitious, but there are principles that apply in all sorts of different ways and in all sorts of different places. You know, we talked about collaborative assessment. That's something that the IB has in some of our art subjects, but it's something that we could explore more generally. A lot of these things are things that we do small amounts of, but it's in this course, it's kind of ramped up to, you know, dialed up to 11, you know. It's like, so it's not that we don't do these things. It's not that the IB hasn't always thought, you know, this kind of thinking is really important, but it's how do you incorporate it within a high stakes assessment system and university admission. So I think the thing that really excites me about this project is also the thing that makes it quite challenging. We're taking things that often might fit a little bit more comfortably, for example, in a co-curricular program. So in our creativity, activity and community service, in our community engagement pieces, and you're taking those things and you're making them the center of their experience and the center of the academic course, and then underpinning them with really thorough research skills
and communication skills.
So you're taking these things that can sometimes be pushed to the edge and really making them the central focus. And that's what's really exciting for this. But also, as I say, what makes it challenging is it would be super easy to design, you know, this kind of an experience without an assessment and not within the diploma and not within a high stakes environment, just as a classroom experience. But I think what's really powerful about this is you're transforming it from the inside and actually making it part of the program, part of the qualification, part of the diploma. And that's the thing that makes it hard, but also for me, the thing that makes it a really worthwhile thing to be trying to do.
Look, I couldn't agree more. I think this is just so worthwhile and so timely. You know, tell us a little bit more about the relationship that the International Baccalaureate has with the United World Colleges Group.
The UWC movement and the IB are kind of interlocking histories and kind of cousins. So UWC Atlantic was one of the very first IB schools, you know, in 1968 when we did the pilot exams with 9 schools. They were one of the original 9. And they both have kind of philosophical alignment and kind of missions that are so aligned in terms of making the world a better, more peaceful place. And so right from the very beginning, UWC Atlantic was one of, as I say, our pioneer original schools that helped develop the IB and the IB diploma in the 1960s. So I think there's a really nice kind of symmetry there that they now are involved so heavily in this next vision and this next iteration of the diploma program for 2030. But I think what's interesting is that this pilot is trying to take some of that original philosophical context that's so strong within the UWC movement and the IB, and then combine it with some really contemporary influences. So if you go back to the beginning, the founder of UWC movement, Kurt Hahn, he wrote about, the decline of the modern youth and everything being quite passive and people not feeling that agency and not getting out of their comfort zone. And he founded, for example, the Outward Bound movement, which was all about kind of get out of your own head and walk up a mountain and push yourself out of your comfort zone. Or his original school in Salem, the students were the volunteer fire service for the village. It's this really remarkable focus on kind of service and on community. And it's also really important at the IB. If you go back to the origins of the IB, it was set up in the 1960s as a way to try to avoid World War III. Philosophically, that was the point, to develop international mindedness and intercultural understanding, but also to provide that kind of broad, balanced, conceptual education that people felt was missing in some places. They felt that education was becoming narrower at that 16 to 18 phase. And actually, what really matters at that age is that learning to learn and thinking like a historian and thinking like a scientist and having that breadth. So I think this kind of pilot is very, very aligned with those kind of founding ideas and founding principles of the IB, but is then trying to really combine that with really contemporary influences in education. If you take books like Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Andreotti, or you take the work of institutes like the Villars Institute in Switzerland, who do systems thinking. So it's trying to take those classic IB and UWC influences and merge them and combine them with some really contemporary directions in education. And I think that's one of the things that makes this pilot really, really special.
And I think it goes without saying, and our listeners will certainly agree, that that kind of mission and vision for education is what we need when we're thinking about how we want to transform education, especially now in terms of bringing peace and community and respect. And on that note, and before we finish up, Jenny, when we think about the respect for the profession and for the teachers, this is a really big ask for teachers who, teach within a discipline in the high school and are not so accustomed to teaching in a transdisciplinary context.
Absolutely. So the course is going to be demanding for schools to implement, but we are trying to be really conscious of that in the design. But I think for the teachers, what's really interesting is it's going to be challenging, for example, because it's transdisciplinary. So for most teachers at that 16 to 18 age group, they're used to operating within their disciplines. They're used to operating within their sort of isolated subject. They're a maths teacher and they've studied maths at university. They're a biology teacher and they've studied biology at university. And I think what's interesting with this course is because of the transdisciplinary nature, it just doesn't fit in a box like that.
And I imagine it really has turned up the reliance on collaboration and teamwork for the faculty too.
Absolutely. It's really stressed the importance of collaboration between teachers, not just between students. So across the 4 pilot schools, we again have slightly different models. We have some of the schools are co-teaching it. So you have, for example, maybe an anthropology teacher and a biology teacher co-teaching the course together in the classroom. We have another model where it's a single teacher, but they've had a kind of advisory group or a kind of steering committee of other teachers who are advising them and helping with the curriculum development side. So they're kind of drawing on that and they're bringing those teachers in as a kind of expert for a small workshop session or a kind of ask the expert session when it's that particular topic, it's particularly kind of relevant.
Jenny, I think what you're, illustrating for us here is something that we haven't actually really, been able to kind of quite articulate properly in the podcast so far. And it's an important aspect about what it really looks like for an education system like the International Baccalaureate, a global system that, does all this research and collaboration and collaborative innovation to design curriculum, to find out what the curriculum should be and how to assess that and how to really authentically join those things together through learning and teaching. But the role of the teachers and what it takes what the expectations that are placed then on teachers to be part of that collaborative design and that co-design, to bring that home for the students in a relevant and rich and accountable way.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons why this pilot is aiming to go mainstream in 2030. And one of the reasons it's quite a lengthy pilot is because we really recognise the need to build good support materials exemplar materials, teacher training opportunities, and to build that capacity. This is not the kind of thing that you can just roll out, kind of instantly. But just to go back to your point about collaboration between teachers, I think that has been really key. And what we've noticed as well through the pilot so far is that there are just things that are just different to a regular course. So I mentioned that the assessment model doesn't have exams, but that means that you don't have exams to use for trial exams, or you don't have exams to use for unit tests, or, past papers to use for that. So the teachers are having to design slightly different kinds of classroom assessments compared to normal. So there's just, and how you do your anticipated grades for university might be slightly different. And so it has this kind of knock on. As soon as you start doing something differently, it is in itself a system. So you have these ripples through the system, and lots of things that are a little bit different that require us to think a little bit differently. It requires teachers to operate a little bit differently to normal. I think for me, it's also on a personal level. I really enjoy working for the IB, and it's an opportunity to bring about change that very few people have that privilege to be able to work on, and it's like, I feel like in my job, if I can make an experience a bit better for students or a bit better for teachers, you can have that impact on hundreds of thousands of people, and that's an amazing privilege and an amazing position to be in. It's also a huge amount of pressure sometimes, but it's an amazing position to be in, to think something that you're working on and something that you can really take the views of teachers and represent them and try and translate that into an actual action and a change that they will be helpful to teachers and schools and students all around the world. And that's got to be hugely motivating, hasn't it?
You've been listening to the Education by Design podcast. I've been your host, Phil Evans. If you like this episode, please hit subscribe or follow and join us for our next episode. And until next time, stay curious. And I think what's really interesting about this design is that it really, it pushes us as educators to think away from the 5-step model or the practice, drill and kill. It really is developmental for the students, clearly, but I think also for the educators that, year after year, as you come back and you think about your plan and you think about the students that you have in this particular cohort, that there's a real, growth-oriented aspect that the design then contributes to, the system of education that we're working within. It's really cool. I think I already know the answer to this question, Jenny, but I want to know, what does a person who's innovating in education the way that you are, what do you hope for when you think about, what students can gain from school and the future of learning in schools?
That's a big question. I think for me, what I really hope is that the things that are already special about an IB education, we can really deepen and maximize and kind of bring to the forefront. So for me, an IB education, it's got a really clear philosophical point to it and a really clear kind of mission to make the world a better place through education. It's kind of unashamedly values driven. It doesn't pretend not to be. And I think that kind of, if we can have students who can think critically and be open-minded, just that in itself is just a massive thing. But the systems angle for me, I think, just adds that layer to that and takes it to the next level, that you're able to connect the dots and you're able to make those connections and you're able to appreciate complexity and you're able to be tolerant of ambiguity and uncertainty. So for me, it's really similar, actually. I used to look after the IB's Theory of Knowledge course. And that has some quite similar aims as well about, being able to sit comfortably with that ambiguity and uncertainty in the world and not be paralyzed by it or overwhelmed by it, but actually realize that it's just part of the world and part of what you're trying to navigate and have this toolkit at your disposal to be able to navigate it effectively. So that's, I guess, what I hope for this course is that it equips students with the kind of cognitive tools to navigate a kind of cognitively complex world, but also the kind of social tools to navigate this socially complex world around them as well. And I think if it can do those two things, I think an IB education does, but I think this version of it will do that even more so. And that's what I hope this pilot will do. And hopefully, if the pilot goes well, we can launch this for all IB schools who want to do it for 2030.
Amazing. I can't wait. I just think about what an incredible proof point this is for learning in a way where students have an experience that they can't really unlearn. I think about some of the testimonies that I've heard from various guests on the podcast so far of teachers that made an impact. And it was often around curriculum learning experiences that were really meaningful and really challenging, and had that sort of flexibility for students to discover something about themselves. And that's really, what I'm taking from this conversation with you, Jenny, is just how powerful and how intentional it is to think about those experiences that will last forever.
I think you're really right that it goes beyond the kind of the really formal parts of the curriculum. So that's one of the reasons when we designed the portfolio task, we were really explicit with the students that they can put kind of anything in their portfolio. It could be a homework task that they were assigned. It could be an element of their formal assessment task, but it could also be a student festival they organise that's a little bit outside of the regular kind of course, or it could be an interaction they had with a teacher, gave them some feedback, and then it's how they responded to that feedback and they realized they didn't respond to that feedback very well. Or so we've been really open with that portfolio about the kinds of artifacts that can go in it from their whole more broad learning experience from the course, the formal and non-formal elements of the course. And I think that's really important, that this course will throw up all sorts of interesting things. beyond the kind of the strictly academic format of the curriculum topics. Actually just the interactions, the relationships, all of the whole experience. And I think that's what's really important for me for this, is it is that more holistic kind of experience for the students and what they'll get out of it. And then the other thing that I think is really important for this is the fact that we've been really explicit in making this an assessment pilot. And I've spoken a lot about assessment. And the reason for that is that I think sometimes assessment can be kind of demonized as kind of like everyone wants to do really cool stuff in education and then assessment gets in the way. And I think that's a real mistake. And I think this shows that assessment can be really powerful and it can be supporting curricular goals, you know? And I think that's, for me, it's challenging. I'm not pretending that it's not. It's a really difficult thing to get right. But I just feel like it's so worth the effort of trying to transform it rather than just kind of writing it off and saying, you know, assessment will always be kind of traditional and it will never keep up with the exciting curriculum side. And it's like so that's why that's been such a key part of this pilot for me. It's because personally, I think that that's one of the most powerful things we can do to transform education at this 16, 17, 18-year-old age is if we can make improvements and transformations to the assessment. That's the thing that I can think will have a real powerful impact on both the teacher experience and the student experience.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.